Desert Queen. The sand rippled like a rock skipping across water as the wind stirred. As if the sun's painful rays were not punishment enough, heat rose from the ground itself to envelop the caravan battling through the unforgiving desert. War had ravaged their home, leaving the residents little choice but to flee their Babylonian empire, leaving it in the hands of the reapers. Someday, perhaps, they could return, but the priority was to save those who could escape. Towards the head of the procession stood a man touched by fire. His grief-filled eyes surveyed the long line of citizens trudging through the bitter sand. "Lord Kratz," one called, and the man turned to regard a creature who at first glance seemed human, but held the angular facial features of a wolf. "What is it, Locke?" Lord Kratz replied. Locke inclined his head slightly. "Her Majesty requests a word." With a barely suppressed eye-roll and groan, Lord Kratz began descending the dune, passing dozens of battle-weary bodies. Some afforded the tired lord a grateful smile, but more held nothing but bitter glares. He sighed quietly, lacking the energy to lock into verbal battle to defend his actions. Grief could do awful things. Roughly midway along the caravan was a series of large, four-legged, muscly creatures with the heads of manes of horses and leathery skin. The Leviathans were capable of making the treacherous journey across the desert due to how scarcely they needed water. Of course, when they did drink, especially after such a long journey, the creatures could practically empty the water reserves. Perched atop the first one was a litter made of light, airy mesh fabric to protect the inhabitants from the sun and wind. A tap from the driver's guiding rod guided the Leviathan out of the procession. The giant creature dropped to its front knee, and the driver tossed a rope ladder along the side to allow Lord Kratz to ascend. As the fiery lord climbed, he tried to prepare himself for the sight that would soon greet him. When he reached the top, he nodded at the driver, who was also the queen's consort. "How is she?" Lord Kratz inquired. The driver rubbed at the crest on his shoulder, face drawn in concern, yet a fierce pride shone out from beneath his visor. "She's a fighter, sir," came the gruff reply. Lord Kratz clasped a hand on the other man's shoulder, but said nothing more. Despite his own sense of loss, he couldn't begin to understand the pain. He had been away from the city when the raid on Babylon began, and though he had returned as quickly as he could, Lord Kratz had nearly been too late to help anyone. With a gulp, he steeled himself and pulled back the opening of the litter. A resounding growl met his ears immediately. A mid-sized bobcat flicked his tail dangerously, ears flattened against his head. "You," he growled at the intruding lord. The Babylonian queen, despite the blood-soaked bandages that even her gown couldn't cover, was still rapturous. Her dark hair fell from its pins, making her seem younger than her years. She winced as she tried to straighten her posture, and Lord Kratz pretended not to notice. Guilt coursed through him at the sight of the queen's state. He pushed it down, knowing it wouldn't be helpful for the conversation at hand. Averting his eyes, he said, "You summoned me, your majesty." She rested a hand on the bobcat's powerful shoulders to signal to the protective creature that he needn't attack. Clearing her throat, the queen attempted to capture some of her usual authority. "I need to know, how is everyone?" Lord Kratz ran a hand through his hair. He'd been expecting this question, but he still didn't like the answer he would have to give. The queen had been unconscious for the better part of 2 suns, but that wasn't nearly enough time to quell the despair in his own heart after the attacks. "They are weary and hungry. The thirst will take us soon if we don't find sanctuary." She nodded sagely, her dark eyes focused. "How many were lost?" "Too many," he whispered. My daughter?" the queen asked, struggling against the grief and pain of failing her people. "Safe and aboard another Leviathan with the other children," Lord Kratz rapidly reported. "Several warriors bravely defended the children until we could get to them." The scene flashed in his memory as one of his fiercest knights shoved the princess into Lord Kratz's own hands and charged back into the fray. He studied the palm of his hands, feeling the dame's reassuring grip on his arm, seeing her grim, determined smile. "They saved more than 24 of the young ones." His voice sounded flat, even to his own ears. The queen nodded, understanding without the lord's clarification. Though tears stung at her eyes, she swallowed the lump in her throat, relief battling compassion in her heart. "May Azrael guide them. They will forever be honored for their sacrifice." Regaining his composure, Lord Kratz continued, "Of those who escaped, we have roughly 30 wounded, none so grievously as yourself, your majesty. The rest are tired but whole. Lord Linden and Locke assure me that we are on the right path to safety." He paused and added, "Though they admit they aren't quite sure what that'll look like." The queen let out a pained chuckle, then grimaced. "Should we come across somewhere that looks promising, I'd like to be among the scouting party." Lord Kratz opened his mouth to argue, but thought better of it. "As you wish. In that case, I insist you rest. Climbing these creatures is not an easy task, even without such injury." Nodding with a wry smile, the queen dismissed him, and as he departed, she turned to look out the mesh covering at the sea of sand. Her hand gingerly rested on the bandages around her waist as she chewed her lip in a most unregal manner, Despite the litter, she could still feel the arid heat wafting around like the breath of Hades. The bobcat nudged a water flask towards the queen's hand. She took a small sip and sighed. The attack by the warlords had devastated her small kingdom and nearly took her with it. She hoped those warriors, the Valkyries who fell in battle to save the citizens, would find their way to eternal peace in Valhalla. As for the living, they needed to find a safe haven, a place away from all the havoc and terror. When the Leviathan started moving again, the queen slowly drifted off to sleep, her brow drawn in worry for the future. The queen stood in darkness. Flashes of light danced around, torches brandished alongside swords and pikes. The chamber should have been filled with screams and cries, but was eerily silent. A bird's serene song echoed all around her as everything went dark again, until a ball of flame soared over the queen's head. She followed it with her eyes, but didn't draw a weapon. The flame flew in another arc and left the chamber. She followed, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The flame danced just ahead, leading the queen through the familiar halls of the palace until suddenly it stopped in the center of the atrium. Columns sprung up all around, ornately carved as though showing the way to Olympia itself. The queen stopped too, and she looked down as liquid met her bare feet. Water and blood pooled around her. Her gaze shifted back to the fire as tears stung her eyes. That was when she realized the flame wasn't a ball at all, but a bird. The bird sang again, mournful in its cry, and the fire expanded out from it further, growing larger, hotter, and brighter, until the queen had to shield her eyes. With an explosion, the bird disappeared, plunging the atrium into darkness, save for the glow of the moon overhead. With slow, halting steps, the queen moved to the center, to a small pile of ashes. She fell to her knees with a slight splash as the tears streamed down her face and grief threatened to overwhelm her. Her body ached from sobbing, but, with no one around, she did not bother to hide it, instead letting the full force of pain and anguish of the broken kingdom wash over her. So many lives lost, and their blood was on her hands because she had failed to protect them. When there was nothing but the sound of the queen's breathing once more, a chirp erupted from the pile of ashes, a muffled and almost choked sound. The queen, without even thinking about it, scooped up the ashes in both hands, lifting it to her face, and gently blew away the cinders. The tiny creature had pink, nearly translucent skin and a large beak the color of gold. As the phoenix's obsidian eyes met the queen's, it gave another chirp, this time full of power and hope. It threw its head into the ashes again and emerged with an object in its beak. It hopped clear of its cinder bed and dropped a blood-red cylindrical seed onto the queen's bare skin. "Your Majesty," a voice pierced through the darkness, followed by a softer, gentler whisper. "My queen." She awoke slowly, stirring reluctantly from the dream. Physical pain cascaded upon her body as she regained consciousness. "What is it?" the queen asked. Her eyes fell upon her beloved, whose hand rested on her shoulder. "Lord Kratz found something promising and said you'd want to see it." The queen nodded and accepted help in changing her bandages and donning a light gown. The stalwart man in charge of the warriors had been right. Climbing the Leviathan was no easy task. Slowly, painfully, she made her way to the sand. Night had fallen, and the caravan had stopped to take advantage of the cooler weather for resting. Citizens greeted the queen as she passed. Several made as though to stand and bow, but she waved them off and told them to save their energy. Toward the head of the caravan, Lord Kratz sat upon a horse, a torch mounted at the front of the saddle. Though it cast shadows, the queen thought the lord looked especially tired. Beside him, Locke held the reins of another horse, which he passed to the queen with his head bowed. She accepted the reins, mounted the horse gracefully, and set off following Lord Kratz's lead, with Locke following. Despite the sand, the horses practically flew, responding to the lightest directions from their riders. Were it not for the ache that lingered over them, they may have actually enjoyed the journey. With the lack of light, the queen did not realize what it was they had reached until she drew her horse to a stop right in front of a series of lively green shrubs. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to Lord Kratz. Though he couldn't see her, he confirmed her suspicion. "The scouts found an oasis." "How large?" she asked as she dismounted and started walking. She heard her companions follow suit. "Large enough, perhaps." She felt the tiniest glimmer of hope stir inside her heart, but kept it in check. Lord Kratz passed her the torch so she could see for herself as she walked. The light reflected back at her as she approached the water, dancing along the ripples. More vegetation grew along the water's edge. The queen suddenly turned around and raised the torch high. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The scouts Lord Kratz had sent stood in a small group further up the bank, but that wasn't what alerted her. Among the nightly serenade of the insects was a distinct call that seemed both familiar and strange. From above swooped a bird-like creature which settled on a branch eye level with the queen. Its bulbous eyes sat on either side of its head, so that it had to turn to stare at her with one eye, then the other. "Kee-o!" it sang. The queen smiled and watched as the bird fluttered and settled, constantly staring. Lord Kratz came up alongside her. "You don't find that thing awkward?" he asked skeptically. "Not even a little," she answered. "Why would she think it awkward?" Locke asked, patting Lord Kratz's shoulder. "After all, it looks better than you." The queen reached out and held her arm still, waiting. After a few more turns of its head, the bird hopped closer to the queen. She stood like a statue. The bird finally flew over to her, its sharp claws resting against, but not piercing the queen's skin. Again it stared at her. Again she smiled. With no warning, the bird took off, leaving the tiniest scratch on the queen's arm. "What was that?" Lord Kratz asked, staring after the bird. "A K-bird," the queen replied. "Come on, let's get back to the others. I think, at the very least, this will give us a place to rest." The sun was high in the sky by the time the caravan reached the first shrubs. In daylight, the water looked clear, bright, and welcoming. Leafy trees clumped together in spurts to offer plenty of shade, while the lake appeared to go on forever. Her daughter's tiny hand clutched the queen's as they walked along the shore, and the journey across the desert already felt like a lifetime ago. "Kee-o," came the song, and the queen's head snapped around to search for the K-bird. It drifted to them on a gentle breeze and came to land on the queen's outstretched arm again. Its head dipped to its claws, then dropped an object into the queen's hand. The K-bird had delivered a seed the color of blood. "Clever bird," the princess cooed as she stroked the bird's sleek feathers. The queen smiled, her fingers closing around the seed. Together, she and her daughter found the perfect spot to plant it, far enough away from other plants so it would not be crowded, but central enough to be reminded to care for it. After a while, the former Babylonians decided to make the oasis their home. When this was decided, they turned to their queen for guidance. "What do we call this place?" they asked. She strolled by the lake, pondering the question. Shelters had started to give way to structures and settlements, but still, the place where the seed was planted was left untouched. And that is where she went, only to find the seed had sprouted into a baby tree, its stem barely hardening to a bark, deep red in color. The queen knelt by the sapling. "Kee-o," came the bird's cry as it flew overhead. And so it came to her, the name of their new home. "Kyoto," she whispered to the wind.